Greetings. Welcome, everybody. There's still people flowing in. I just wanted to say that this is a very special day. Welcome to Earth's Changing Climate, and welcome to some visitors that were interested in attending. As you can see in the background of the slide that I'm showing you here, the Atlantic now features 5 active storm systems that are near hurricane strength. Only the second time in recorded history that's happened. The haze in the sky above our heads is related to the smoke in the California, Oregon, and Washington wildfires that we saw, that we discussed during our last class. Our civilization's confronting twin challenges: climate and this terrible pandemic. These challenges are related. And today I'm very excited that we have visiting us and joining us Dr. Nirav Shah from the Maine Center for Disease Control. Dr. Shah received his degrees in medicine and law from the University of Chicago. He studied economics at Oxford. He traveled the world and the country advising on public health, and he came to Maine in 2019 as the director of the Maine CDC. Dr. Shah is a dedicated and meticulous scientist. He's a gifted public speaker, which is so important right now, and he is, perhaps most important, truly cares about people, and it comes across in every public briefing that he does. And he cares about the people of Maine. And he's going to share with us some of his thoughts on these twin scientific challenges that our society is facing today. So thank you so much, Dr. Shah, for joining us. I'm so grateful. So take it away, please.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Professor Putnam, thank you so much for the invitation to join everyone today. Really delighted to be here and chat with everybody. What I'd like to do is maybe talk for 12 minutes or so, maybe I can cut it short, and then turn it over to you guys and your students for any questions. I see we've got close to 90 people, and so I'd like to provide a forum for students in particular to ask questions, share concerns, disagree with me, which would be even the best, and ask me the toughest questions you can. So I'm going to try to limit what I say rather than talk at you. I'm going to say a couple of things that I hope will be the foundation points for questions you've got. So I want to be somewhat, maybe a bit more deliberately provocative today, given that this is a university setting as opposed to just a public talk. I want to say things and hope that you will push back on them or ask me hard questions in response, particularly as it relates to the nexus of climate change and COVID. So let me start off with a couple of ways to think about the enormity of the challenge in front of us. And think about the nexus between COVID-19 and climate change through a couple of different lenses. Let's start with one of the ones that is common and foundational to both public health as well as to climate change, which is that insofar as there are solutions or potential ways to ameliorate the challenge of both, they fundamentally lie with behavior change, individual as well as societal level behavior change. And what has been interesting about COVID-19 to me is the way in which, in a matter of 7 or 8 months, we have, by we I mean public health officials around the state of Maine and maybe around the country, have managed to convince, using a mixture of carrots and sticks, we've been able to instill widespread behavior change, right? So think about this. For most of your lives, one of the refrains in public health has been don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke. But smoking rates haven't changed significantly over a number of years. They've gone gradually down, but not dramatically so. The same thing with things like eating a healthy diet, getting exercise. Each and every one of you students has heard those things your entire lives. But the change on those metrics around people eating healthier diets, exercising more, has been minuscule, at least perhaps at the margins. Enter COVID-19, and in a matter of 7 or 8 months, the entire country has, for the most part, completely changed the way that we go about living, working, and playing. What has been the secret to accomplishing that behavior change with respect to COVID-19, and what can we learn from that as it relates to climate change? That's a question, and I'd love to get your questions on that question. The second observation. One of the other commonalities between COVID-19 and climate change, indeed, as with so many societal level problems, is that the harms from both are visited upon the poorest, most marginalized members of our global society. So let's start on a global scale first. Both COVID-19 as well as climate change exact their high toll on the poorest, most resource limited groups across the country, across the world. So if you are a poor island nation in the Pacific, climate change is literally an existential threat to you. The same is to be said with COVID-19. Similarly, within our own borders in the United States, you don't need to look further than the hurricanes that Professor Putnam noted, one of which is bearing down on the southern coast along the Gulf Coast right now. Many of you may remember a lot of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and you may have remembered that it was the poorest among the poor in and around New Orleans who suffered the most as a result of Hurricane Katrina. The same scenario is playing out with COVID-19 just within our own state. COVID-19 has had the hardest impact on two interrelated groups of people, the poor and racial and ethnic minorities. The same will be said of climate change as well. So as we think about these problems societally, which we do, we also have to make sure we bear in mind that the effects of these problems will not be visited homogeneously. There will be certain groups who bear the lion's share, the brunt of the negative consequences. We owe it to them to start thinking about these problems much sooner rather than later. The third observation I want to make is related, again, a commonality between COVID and climate change. COVID, as well as climate change, fundamentally require individuals to make changes to the way they live, to the way they work, to the way they consume, to the things they purchase. But it simultaneously requires societies, groups of people, to make changes as well. In some instances, the needs and the preferences of a group are in line with the needs and preferences of the individual. And when that happens, we're in good stead. But all too often, the needs of the individual are at odds with the needs of the group. So what's good for one person may not be what's good for the group, and vice versa. When it comes to climate change, aligning those things, either through incentives or through regulatory requirements, is really, really critical. The last thing I want to say is something I would like you to remember. You can forget everything I've talked to you up until now. Here's what I want you to remember. It's impossible in a group like this to raise your hand, but for those of you who are at least on my screen, who among you is aware of the story of Easter Island? If you're kind of aware of Easter Island, signal to me somehow or other. All right, so some are. I'm gonna walk through this a little bit, and what I'm about to say is debated and contested by many different scholars across the academic spectrum. So I'm offering this more as a parable and less as a lesson in academic anthropology. But perhaps those of you who do go into academic anthropology will be able to divine whether what I'm talking about actually bears truth. But there is a story around Easter Island. And Easter Island is an island in the South Pacific, midway between Chile and New Zealand. It's pretty isolated. And legend has it, or some anthropologists have it, that many, many centuries ago. So one of the interesting topographic features with respect to the flora on Easter Island is that there are no trees on Easter Island at all. Now, many of you may be familiar with Easter Island through pop culture. This is the island where there are these very notable stone sculptures that have been erected across and around the island. And the islanders of Easter Island erected these as a way to pay homage to their gods. And you've seen these representations called moais in popular culture. They're on a Pink Floyd album, so on and so forth. Pink Floyd may not be a reference that resonates, but in any event, legend has it that many, many centuries ago, these trees were cut down as a mechanism to transport these massive multi-ton stone blocks from the quarry on one part of the island to the shores, where they were ultimately sculpted into the features that we know them to be now. And trees were cut down in order to roll the stone sculptures accordingly, or the stone blocks accordingly. The story goes that at some point, the removal of all the trees on Easter Island precipitated an ecological collapse. That then, at least according to the rendition of one prominent anthropologist, a gentleman named Professor Jared Diamond at UCLA, the removal of all of these trees precipitated an ecological collapse, which then precipitated a more broad societal collapse. And there are different mechanisms by which this may have been thought to happen. These trees were cut down by the islanders themselves. They weren't the result of a hurricane that blew through and knocked them all down. They were, over a period of years, decades, systematically cut down in order to roll the stone blocks to their final place where they could be sculpted. And so here we have a question that emerges that I want everyone to keep in mind forever, which is this. What were the people who cut down the very last tree on Easter Island saying when they cut that tree down? Right? Were they saying to themselves, hey, I'm just doing what I'm told. I'm just doing what the boss told me to do? Or were they saying, don't worry about it, science will come up with the solution to this? Or was anyone saying, hey, guys, this is a bad idea, because if we cut down this last tree, soil erosion is going to go crazy, and we're not going to be able to have shade for our livestock. And man, this could precipitate an ecological disaster that might lead to the undoing of our island. Did anyone say that? The question is important because it's similar to the question that we're facing right now today, with respect to climate change. We're in a similar situation with respect to the last trees on Easter Island. And what you never want to be in as a decision maker or as a student, you never want to be in a situation where historians 20, 50, or 100 years from now are going to look back and say about our current status in 2020 what we look back and say about the Easter Islanders a couple hundred years ago. So whoever writes the history of 2020, we all have a collective obligation to make sure that we are not being looked at in the same way that we look at those Easter Islanders of several decades, several hundred years ago. We've got an obligation to think through the implications of each and every decision we make. Because when it comes to climate change, as it was for the Easter Islanders, once that last tree is cut down, you can't roll back the clock. So with that, I am going to open it up to questions. I unfortunately have a hard stop right around 1 o'clock because of a thing I've got to do at 2 o'clock today. And so I'm going to stop talking now, and either Professor Putnam, have you moderate in a manner that you see fit, or just open it up to questions, especially from those who maybe disagree with something I've said.
Yeah, I say let's open it up to questions. You can type it in the chat if you want, or just speak up. Question is anybody?
I have a question relating to working during the pandemic. A lot of people have been forced to go remote with their jobs, and this is it's worked for a lot of people. So once this whole thing is hopefully taken care of, do you think there should be a push to remain individualized working from home for a lot of workers who can do that?
Maybe. It's so, there's two radically distinct perspectives on working from home. And I think the way I think about them in my head is there's one group of people who kind of capture the situation as you did, Aaron, which is people are working from home. But I think we have to allow for a radically different interpretation, which is not that people are working from home, that people are resigned and relegated to their homes, and they happen to figure out a way to work while they're at home. Which is to say, a lot of people are really unhappy, and they manage to scrape by with a couple of hours of work per day. And so, unclear exactly which is playing out. For some folks, they're thrilled to be at home. Others are kind of miserable. But you ask a good public health related question. I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. I think clearly this has made us all rethink the nature of the office, the nature of work. I mean, the implications of your question are pretty staggering. Commuting is a big driver of vehicle emissions. So from a climate perspective, think about the potential benefits purely of reducing the number of commuting miles. There are my colleagues on the political science end of the spectrum that started thinking about the electoral implications of what you've talked about. If folks don't need to be in an office anymore, it doesn't really matter where they live. Thus, people are free to move elsewhere, which means that the electoral map could be redrawn. Talking about that on a panel on Friday. So I don't know what the answer is, but it's going to have remarkable implications.
Hi, I have a question. I can't have my screen right now, but can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so I am wondering how COVID-19, how the actual pandemic is specifically affecting the environment in both positive and negative ways, and like what it's doing to climate change.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. So let's start with a very, very short-term phenomenon that I can't express how short-term it was, which is very early on in the pandemic, as cities across the globe shut down, there were momentary improvements in air quality in some of the worst polluted cities on the globe, New Delhi, Beijing, to name just two. But that was very fleeting, very, very fleeting, not anything we would see any permanence from. Other impacts of COVID on climate change, I think it's too early to tell what other widespread impacts there are. But let's reverse the question, which is to say the impacts of climate change on pandemics and the emergence of pandemics like COVID. As climate change continues to march, it precipitates movement of people in different and unexpected ways. So among other things, it's related to the destruction of many forest environments, which lead to greater urbanization, certainly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, as well as South America. That greater urbanization and density leads to people being in closer proximity with livestock, which in many instances is one way pandemics can be precipitated. And thus, the impact of COVID on climate change, too early to say, but the impact on climate change on precipitating global pandemics, I think there's more to speak of on there, and unfortunately, it's not promising.
There's some questions in the chat. For example, do you have any idea of methods that can be used to influence people to mobilize on climate the way we mobilized on COVID?
Yeah, there's, here it is. Okay, so Sam asks that question. The short answer is that I have some ideas, but you have to be careful when you mobilize. You want to motivate both by hope, but not too much by fear. fear is an uncertain way to mobilize large groups of individuals. You also want to use the right mix of incentives as well as regulatory penalties. So with respect to climate change, again, it's probably going to be a matter of all of those things. With COVID, it was a bit more by fiat, but the virus itself led to radical changes in behavior. When you look at things like the rate at which restaurant reservations were canceled prior to states imposing restrictions on indoor dining, it was the virus itself that was generating those changes, not so much regulations. How that relates to climate change, it's hard to say. You want to be accurate, you don't want to be too overblown in anything, but it's hard to understate the role of climate change right now.
So this is Jeff Graham. I'm a physician who was invited to come. You mentioned carrots and sticks, and how in smoking we've been relatively, maybe somewhat unsuccessful in preventing the rise in that. Is there some good model with some other disease process or something that would involve, people's behavior, where there might be some sense of when to use a carrot, when to use a stick, or that's a very complicated question?
It's very, very difficult because when we think about individual level behavior, one of the things that can often accompany the sticks is the generation of stigma. So we learned that lesson, sadly, the very hard way with respect to the opioid crisis, where opioid use was for the most part, was viewed as a stick problem. You need to clamp down on X, Y, and Z. And when something is framed as bad, those who engage in it are then almost unfortunately stigmatized. And and many of you may have read or be aware that the stigmatization of matters of that nature had its own set of consequences. In other situations, we don't think stigma is so bad. Maybe stigmatizing folks who smoke isn't so bad. Who knows? I'm not a ethicist or a medical sociologist. So the getting the balance right between encouraging individuals through the use of incentives versus penalizing them or regulating them through other mechanisms, that is one of the hardest questions when it comes to governance or regulating or managing any problem. And all of you are going to grow up to be in some position in a world where you are going to have to make decisions about whether you incentivize people to do what you wish them to do or whether you penalize them for not doing so. Climate change is exhibit A in that. And when you get into the policies behind a lot of this, you'll see approaches that use both. You don't have to have it figured out right now, but you do need to recognize that when it comes to behavior change, there's more than one option on the table.
There's a question in the chat from Xander Roman. It says, based on our response to a global pandemic, does it give you hope or fear to how we will move forward addressing our current climate problem? Will one overshadow another? What do you think?
Wow, Xander, that's an excellent question, Xander. So at some point, COVID will be in the rearview mirror for us. I don't know when that point is. It will likely be at some point after there is a widespread availability of rapid testing coupled with a vaccine. I'm not sure when that will be. So at some point, COVID will be in the rearview mirror. But I don't think one will necessarily overshadow the other. But let me answer your question in a positive route and then a negative route. I'll start with the negative, which is there is a very real risk, and this goes back to a prior question, Sam's question about methods. There is a very real risk of message fatigue. We've all experienced this. I mean, honestly, how many of you are sick and tired of hearing all the bad news around COVID? I am, and I live this stuff. It's difficult to keep. The human brain only has so much time and bandwidth to be deeply concerned about one thing. And there is a concern that because climate change is a long-term problem, humans have a very short-term mindset with respect to where they will dedicate their fear and attention. And the long-term nature of climate change, coupled with a built-in short-term bias in the way we think about things that scare us, that's a problem. So that's the negative. The positive, however, is, and I want to go back to the Easter Island thing for a second. It is very common, and you will hear this refrain throughout your education and then into your career. You will very commonly hear people say that big and hard things cannot be done. That's too big of a problem to tackle. No way we can do that. That's just too hard. And the next time someone says that to you, which will probably not be very far off into the future, I want you to say back to them, well, wait a minute, that's not right. Because look at the ways that society fundamentally reordered itself in a matter of 2 or 3 months when it came time to COVID-19. Now, COVID has been very hard. Nearly 200,000 people in America have died. It has been tragic. But to the extent there is any silver lining, one of those silver linings is that when it comes time to doing hard things, we can get it done. If the stakes are high enough and if the guidance is clear enough. The same mindset should apply for each and every one of you when it comes to climate change. The stakes are high. The scientific, what we need to do is generally well understood, if not entirely agreed upon. So now it's a question of political will, as well as societal will. That's going to be up to you guys to bring to the table. So Xander, to your question, yeah, I'm concerned because message fatigue sets in, but I'm also optimistic because COVID has demonstrated that we as a society can do really hard things when called upon to do so. And just to be straight, it is also commonplace nowadays for people of my age category and older to say young people can't get it done. And I want you guys to go away from today saying to yourselves, no, my cohort, my peers and I, we can do hard things. We've already done a lot of hard stuff. I mean, think about what each and every one of you have had to deal with for the past 8 months. I mean, let's just be honest. Anyone who answered the question of where do you see yourself in 2020, back in 2019, we all got it wrong, right? And the experience that each and every one of you have had with the things that you've put on hold and the things that you had to forego as part of your college experience demonstrate that you can do hard things. You've got to be organized and have the political will to do them.
That's wonderful. I agree 100%. We have time for maybe one quick question. And if not, I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Shah. I know you have to run right now, but thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for your service to the state of Maine. We're truly grateful. You've been a shining light in this fog of uncertainty. So I appreciate it.
Very kind of you to say. I'm really honored to be able to join you. I apologize. It was only just for this 30 minutes, but maybe when all of this is squarely in the rearview mirror, I'd love to come back and we'll do a debrief on what we learned from climate change as it relates to, or from COVID as it relates to climate change. But very grateful. Academia is very, very, very important to me. And I never try to turn down an invitation to speak with college students. So I'm so delightful to be able to join you even for this short period of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.